Well, good morning, everyone, and I want to thank you all for joining today's session on the topic of providing standardized mobile elevated work platforms, or MEWP training. My name is Tony Grote. I am IPAF North America's manager. I am involved with the ANSI SAIA A92 Safe Use Standards as the committee chair, and I am also a member of the ANSI SAIA 9224 Training Standard Committee. So today I want to kind of give an overview of some of the experiences and questions that I generally run up against when we start talking about training requirements, and try to give you some information so that you can make good business decisions moving forward. However, I would like to begin this session by thanking MCS, who is our sponsor for today's webinar, who makes providing these free webinars possible. So Diego, if you would provide us our message from our sponsor. Okay, thank you, MCS, for your sponsorship for today's event. So when just as a housekeeping issue is that if you have any questions that you would like to pose, if you would please use the Q&A tab on your screen. I don't know if it's on the top or bottom of your screen, and enter your questions there, and we'll try to answer as many of those questions as possible at the conclusion of the presentation. So when we're talking about training, one of the things that I think that everyone looks at is what are the typical reasons that employers look at in making their training decisions. So one of the first ones that always comes to mind is the OSHA requirements. It's the law, so there are certain requirements that you need to legally abide by. We also have ANSI standard, which have requirements for it. They're the agreed industry best practices, and they really are the means to help improve managing your risk and controls of your projects. Oftentimes you have clients who have requirements. I must see proof of training. So that's a driver. You have insurance costs due to claims. So, obviously if you have incidents, you have workers' compensation, general liability, and insurance companies really do look hard at the use of aerial work platforms in operations. And I would suggest to you that they are low in terms of the amount of incident happened, but high in the cost. So if you're working with aerial work platforms in your operations, your insurance companies will look at that. And then prevention of litigation due to lawsuits. So believe me that lawyers will have a copy of the new ANSI standards to use as their best practices. So those kind of give you a parameter, which is what's the motivator to go out there and ensure that your people are trained. And at the end, I'm going to give you a different conclusion. So when we looked at it, how do you choose your MEWP operator training? So when I'm looking at the graph over on the right, it's kind of what I just kind of expressed in terms of the part of the decision that people make, which is I'm going to take some action. So what is the risk involved with me that I have to look at this? So what's the likelihood of an event occurring with mobile elevated work platforms? And I would say, to the benefit of this industry, these are well-designed machines. They're generally well-maintained. They're readily available in the marketplace with a wide range of products to safely provide temporary access to work at height. So realistically, the likelihood of having an accident, a serious accident with these machines with millions out in the marketplace is relatively low. However, when we look at the severity of it, if you have an accident that involves a mobile elevated work platform, the severity is generally high. You have people who are up in the air and fall from an aerial work platform. Doesn't generally end well. So you have a high level of risk. So in my position with IPAF, as a industry that focuses in on the safe and effective use of powered access equipment, and being someone who's heavily involved with industry standards in both the US and Canada, I do get a tendency of having, a lot of dialogue and questions that come to me. So some of these questions are I think, are pertinent about what we're trying to achieve today and our understanding and awareness of this issue, which, one of the questions that generally comes up is, how do you know if the training you're providing your workers is appropriate? So there's lots of training that's out available in the marketplace. So I need to get my people trained. Oftentimes you'll see on the promotion of a lot of training that it's both OSHA and ANSI compliant. So, what does that mean that it's OSHA and ANSI compliant? And who approves training as being compliant? So, when people go over and say, I'm OSHA and ANSI compliant, who said so? What gives you the authority to make that claim? And what are the requirements to measure compliant training against? So if everyone's compliant, how do I make the selection of those that are saying they're compliant training? And can all training in the market be compliant, yet take significantly different times to complete the training from different sources? So how do we have standardized compliant training that someone can deliver in 15 minutes, someone in 2 hours, and someone takes a day? How is that standardized, and how is all of that compliant if they're compliant to the same basic requirements? And at the end of it is, as an employer, do you understand what the industry best practices for MEWP operated training requires in your making that selection? So understanding your risk. So here is kind of an example of slides that I use all the time. These are activities that didn't result in an accident. So there was no accidents. Are these safe operations? Is this a safe workplace? Are these people properly trained? So think about that in context as we're going through this and saying, this is what we commonly see happening in the work environment today. So if this is what we're seeing, are we getting properly trained people operating this equipment? So I go back to this basic premise of are we checking the box versus completing the task? And what does that mean? So as an example, there are two components to MEWP operator training. There's the beginning part, which is known as theory training, which is either done via an instructor in classroom, or that same information is transferred over an online deliverable course. And the second part of the training that's required is when they complete the theoretical knowledge, they can then apply that theory knowledge in what's known as a practical, hands-on use of the equipment and evaluation of their applying that theoretical knowledge. And there's a proliferation of online training out in the marketplace today to satisfy the needs for compliant training without consideration whether the training is also effective at reducing risk, improving productivity, and making your workforce safe. So the basic question that would be in place for me is this compliant-based decisions or value-based decisions? So when I talk about compliance-based, it's like, okay, I need to be compliant. We're going to talk about compliance and a lot of what we're talking about today. But the issue is, when we're using that terminology, is it rooted in just laws and regulations and reactive? It's just something I need to get done. It's done by senior management. So senior management says, okay, here, we need to get this done. Here, go to them. This guy's nearby, and let's get that done. And it's, very compliance-based, where value-based would be rooted in culture and driven by value. So is safety a value of the company as opposed to a requirement that needs to be done? So sometimes the way that you think about the requirement and is how you will also evaluate the program and training that you get. So one of the things that's dominant, especially in the US marketplace, is this compliance issue of OSHA versus ANSI. So when I have these discussions, especially in the construction industries, it's very tied to OSHA. OSHA's law, ANSI voluntary. Nice, but don't have to do that. And when you're looking at the OSHA laws, the regulations that were created through a legislative process. That's how you get an OSHA regulations. And it's a significant challenge in creating and updating these regulations. Know that the aerial lift standards in the construction industry were written in 1970. The OSHA requirements for aerial work platforms reflect a standard that was written in 1969. As opposed to the ANSI standards, which are established state-of-the-art requirements and are created by industry experts from all sides of the industry, sometimes even including the feedback and involvement of OSHA. So when you're looking at the two of those, you end up having this discrepancy in people's minds as, oh, this is required and that's nice, but not necessary. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. So what is OSHA compliant? So being OSHA compliant really means that you're adhering to all the applicable regulations that have been developed and are relevant for the unique working environment. So when you're looking at this very common training that takes place in the marketplace, which is an OSHA 10, which is 10 hours worth of training, sounds like a lot. Wow, 10 hours, and then supervisors get 30 hours worth of training. And it's very general in nature. So you're looking at introduction to OSHA, focus on hazards, health hazards, personal protective equipment. The whole list goes on. And electives that are in there that cover cranes, derrick, hoist, elevators, excavators. So it's kind of like all things. And the one thing that I would say differentiates really what needs to be examined in this training is the old expression, the devil is in the detail. So as people become kind of entrenched in the OSHA versus ANSI requirement versus nice, but not necessarily a requirement that I need to follow, when I look at the OSHA requirements, I look at standards that are very old. In fact, if you really understand the OSHA regulations, they treat a scissor lift as a rolling scaffold tower. So having been in this industry dealing with lifts, ladders, and scaffolding, I will tell you that the training for a rolling scaffold tower is significantly different than the training that I would provide for a scissor lift. So if you look at OSHA, they end up having lots of letters of interpretation. And some of these go back several years. And when I look at them, OSHA, in one of their letters of interpretation, state that there are 2 OSHA standards addressing the qualifications for lift operators. So 2 places that a OSHA regulation addresses this. And the one is 1926.21B2, which requires employers to instruct each employee in the recognition and avoidance of unsafe conditions and the regulations applicable to his work environment. So again, this, awareness of hazards really is a pervasive theme for most of the OSHA regulations. It doesn't just apply to aerial work platforms, it applies to all operations, that an employer must provide a safe workplace free from hazard. So in order to be free from hazards, the recognition and avoidance of hazards, unsafe conditions is a dominant requirement. And does that mean operator training? Does that mean that they're skilled about operator training? And I would suggest not. However, as we look at section 1926.556B2II, here OSHA's requirement is that only authorized persons shall operate an aerial work platform. So those are the 2 requirements within there. And this is, as I said, the 1926 standards, which cover the construction industry. So if I think about it in that context, know the potential hazards. So if you're going to be training in the hazards and you're generic in nature, the question is, are you focused sufficiently on the hazards associated with the specific operation of mobile elevated work platforms? IPAF has been doing industry studies for over a decade now, related specifically to mobile elevated work platforms. And here you can see from 2016 to 2018, this report where it identifies those incidents that occurred specific to mobile elevated work platforms: falls from platforms, electrocutions, entrapment, overturns, hit by vehicle or machines, collisions, crushing, trapping, pinching, loading, tip over, hit by a falling object. MEWPs are inoperable, mechanical technical issues. So as you see here, in the transportation and ground conditions of it, all of these are potential hazards. And so then I take this and I slice the onion a little bit deeper. And here we look at the possible causations from falls from a platform, which is one of those many identified potential hazards. And we end up having violations or behavioral issues or being a leading cause of it. So think about that. Violations and behavioral issues. Training, supervision, big part of how we can potentially lessen that element. Slips, trips, and falls, lack of fall protection, management failure, technical failure, impact by a vehicle, ground conditions, previous checks, and one that was undefined. So here you're looking at it and saying, if I'm going to be doing training and I need to identify those hazards, you really need to make sure that you can slice down sufficiently when it comes to the specific use of these products. And having that knowledge is important. So as we look further at the information regarding OSHA compliant training, There's no specific OSHA regulation that requires aerial lift operators to be either certified or qualified. So again, this quote that I'm giving you here comes from an OSHA letter of interpretation from OSHA. So here in this standard interpretation, which comes in 1992 under the certification of an aerial lift operator, it says in situations where an operator's capabilities are at issue, OSHA would first determine whether the operator was trained, and if no training was provided, issue a citation of violation for 1926 B2. So providing training, and that 1926 B2 is hazard training, which we just kind of referred to. Is that operator training? It is hazard awareness training. And then if training was provided, OSHA would then need to use the general duty clause requirement, which is the 5A1, which is the requirement to provide a safe workplace free from harm. And if you have an accident, you then provide a safe workplace free from harm. So in doing that, and again, this is wording from OSHA's letter of interpretation. In doing so, OSHA would then use the ANSI requirements to help establish what industry practice is regarding operator qualifications. So while OSHA has not adopted by reference all of the ANSI standards, it is something that they utilize in terms of defining what appropriate training is established by our industry. So again, as I said, 1926 is the OSHA regulations for the construction industry. 1910 is the standard that does general industry, so as not to side one place or the other. The 1910 standard that covers man lifts is 1910.68. And here, this section applies to man lifts used to carry only personnel trained and authorized by the employer in use. So here in the letter of interpretation, there's nothing in 1910-67 that requires an employer to certify or designate an operator to another party. Employers have the responsibility to devise methods to train their operators in the safe operation of the aerial lifts. What did that say? Employers have the responsibility to devise methods to train their operators in the safe use. Only competent and careful operators should be assigned to these duties. The operator shall be trained in the safe operation, made familiar with the manufacturer's manuals, especially those parts which relate to operation, maintenance, and safety of aerial devices. So here you can see this thread, which is throwing that responsibility on the employer, and where you get that training from is really critical. So I'm going to now give kind of a little history lesson, because this is my fourth decade plus in this industry, of the history of the ANSI standards. So back in 1992, the standards used to use the term training on delivery. So training upon delivery. And then we had operator training and model training. In 1999 was the first time the ANSI standards introduced the term familiarization. And you're going to learn a little bit more about it if you're not familiar with it, on what that is. So we had familiarization on delivery. Then we had operator training and retraining and familiarization before use. And then in 2006, we harmonized those over all, but we had training and familiarization on delivery, operator training and retraining, and then familiarization before use. And then in 2018, we have what's the standards that are in place today, which are in the suite of standards. And here we have familiarization is offered upon request. And then we have a whole series of operator training qualifications and training requirements. And additionally, new is we actually have a training standard. So not just a training requirement, but a standard on the development for the use and operation, inspection, testing, and maintenance of this equipment. So now you have a standard that specifically talks about how you deliver training, not just the requirement for training. So within these standards, these training standards are now effective in both the US and Canada. So the A92 standards in the US and CSA B354 standards in Canada. And one of the objectives of that standard itself is thorough and consistent training. So within our industry, we identified the need to develop a training standard that will result in thorough and consistent training. So as an industry, that's one of the objectives that we had in developing this training standard. And the training standard, again, not just a training requirement, the standard says, here's the methods and guidelines to preparing mobile elevated work platform training materials. It defines administrative criteria and the delivery of elements required for the proper training and familiarization of this equipment. Now, within our standards, we now have all these different products that are out there, and training is required for the different MEWP classifications. For each classification shall be identified by both the group and type of MEWP for which the training is provided. So here you kind of get a sampling of it. You have type 1, 2, and 3 in groups A and B. So here you can see that we have a group 1A, which is a machine that is vertical and has no ability to drive or be moved when it's elevated. So generally they have outriggers on them. And then we have a 1B, which is a truck or vehicle or towable type boom that requires outriggers before the machine can be elevated. So it's mobile when it's being put into position, but it's not mobile when the platform is elevated in that work. And then the type 3 are vertical lifts and boom type lifts that are mobile when elevated. So you're looking at these, and we train by classification. So if you have an operator, he needs to make sure that his training applies to each one of these categories. Because if you're trained on a scissor lift, it doesn't, which is a 3A, it doesn't mean that you can go out there and operate a 3B, or it's self-propelled boom, or a 1A or a 1B, or any other classification. And I kind of mentioned in here another group, which is the type 2 equipment, which is kind of like an under-bridge inspection device. And you can really understand that, yeah, I don't want someone who's trained on a scissor lift going out there getting on a different type of equipment. We're going to get into this even a little bit more detail. But when we look at the industry standards for training, here are the elements that are within the training in the safe use standard. So safe use of a MEWP when training must be administered in compliance with the A92.22 safe use standard. So the safe use of it is really kind of the foundation of what we're training. So when you're training, you also need to make sure that when you're setting it up and delivering the training, all of that training is done in compliance with the A92.22 safe use standard. So the people who are training it need to be fluent with the safe use requirements, because they're modeling that and using that and applying it when they're using equipment in training itself. The first introduction for a trainee to be seeing what safe operations look like. The training shall be provided to MEWP operators and supervisors. So within the training standard, we now have a new element that's over there, which is MEWP supervisors. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And there's a requirement now for MEWP occupants other than the operators shall receive instructions. So when you get someone, you're putting them into that work platform, you don't want to just necessarily train them as an operator, but there are in that standard requirements for a certain level of guidance, instructions that are required for people who are occupants in here. So again, you can see now within the ANSI standards, there are elements in here that go beyond what OSHA would be requiring. Then we have familiarization, which is model-specific information. We'll get to a little bit more details on that. And then in the standard itself, the training standard, it defines content that must be in the theory classroom training or online course, and then the content for that hands-on practical. So how do you do a hands-on practical? And if you're trying to guess it yourself, here are specific requirements of what should be applied to that. Then we talked about the administration of the training, the training environment. So think about, just the training environment, which we're silent every place else. Here, we're talking about if you're going to do training on a job site in an office trailer with people coming in and out and noise around you, and you're trying to do a presentation and the lighting in there is, you can't hear well. It's not an environment conducive to adult learning. Lots of distractions. So that's why we talk about training in both the classroom and the safety aspect of it in the operation of the equipment. The same level of requirements of safety for its use that you would have using it on the job site. Then we have testing and the documentation of all of that needs to be addressed within the scope of that training. So all of these are elements that you should be aware of that must be included within the scope of the training that you are providing. So here's a mouthful of information, and I'm not going to go through reading this, but this is the defined requirements of content required in the theoretical classroom training that every mobile elevated work platform operator course should be providing. So I don't care whether you're going to say OSHA compliant and ANSI compliant. If it says OSHA and ANSI compliant, believe me, all of this stuff must be in there. And you can see how long it would take just to read it, not alone go into the details and put it into a deliverable that would support adult learning. So there's a lot of information that must be covered in order for an operator to receive all of the instructions necessary for them to be safe and proficient in the operation of this equipment. Then the practical, which is this hands-on evaluation. Here it defines as under the direction and evaluation of a qualified training. So again, we have a qualified trainer, which is a requirement within the standard. And they are directing them and evaluating them. Because now we have all this theoretical knowledge we just gave them, and how are we evaluating that they are applying that theoretical knowledge when they're using this equipment? And the safe operation. So they shall operate the MEWP for a sufficient period of time to demonstrate proficiency regarding these elements. So what are those elements in that practical? A walk around and familiarization of the model piece of equipment that they're using. It's identification of the major components. And when you're looking at the different types of machines, you can see that there's going to be a very critical operational knowledge that comes from being aware of these pieces of equipment, the major components and their functions. You need to perform a daily pre-start inspection. And so while we're not looking for a operator to be a service technician, really what we're looking for them to do is general maintenance. Simple thing, making sure it's fueled or properly charged before you begin operation, making sure that there are no leaks, making sure that they don't see that there's smoke coming from the engine, that there's a leak or electrical shortage or something of that nature, so they can identify some generally obvious elements, and it's done by both the visual and function test, so they can identify that, and if they see something that's wrong, contact a appropriate service technician to address those concerns. You need to plan the route of travel in the workplace inspection. So it's what are the hazards around me? What are the things that I need to be aware of? So they need to be able to have a general knowledge of potential hazards, known potential hazards, and what they need to do to assist in mitigating those. And they should have a guidance, because prior to them being on site, the employer is required to do a site risk assessment to identify these and give them the tools to mitigate some of those. But some of them can be created along the way, because when you go to a job site and one day someone comes out and excavates an area in front of you and then they backfill it over there, is it compacted properly? That may have been not in your original risk assessment, but things that an operator should know about and identify as something that they need to question and get the right authorization to move forward. How do I set the machine up? So if you go over and think about what we call a Group A machine, which is not able to be driven in the elevated position, has outriggers on it. If I go and I set it up in a position and I don't set it up in the right spot, so when I elevate up, I'm a foot further away from reaching what I need to reach. I'm not, what am I going to do now? Am I going to take it down and reset it, move it over, or am I going to do something like stand on the toe boards or mid rails to kind of reach further where I'm at? So you can see how it's important that these all kind of go into the safe and effective use of these equipment. Parking and securing the equipment. All of these are elements that we need to make sure are done, because we need to make sure the safety of others. So we can't park this in a place where we've just blocked the entrance to someone coming in and out of a parking lot. We can't, there's lots of elements that go into this. So it gives you a kind of a scope of the types of things that you should be aware that must be in your training program. So we talked a little about familiarization before. So I'm going to now kind of build a bridge between operator training. So training must be required for the different new classifications. So here I'm going to talk a little bit about where we have an operator who's trained on a 3B, which is a self-propelled boom type lift. So here, this little picture shows you three fundamental different types of 3B self-propelled booms. We end up having a straight mass boom, we end up having an articulated boom, and we have a tower boom. It goes straight up and down. So if you're looking at that machine and they're trained as an operator on 3Bs, and you go and you train him on one machine, and then he goes to a job site and he gets on one of the other machines, how is he going to become proficient about the use of that equipment? And when you're looking at it, here's some examples of various different types of control panels that are significantly different from the one that he was trained upon. So you can see that it's almost impossible to consider that in training, when we train on the classification, you're going to give him all the information he needs to be a proficient operator on all the different types of models that he may be exposed to, from manufacturer to different types of those, even within a same manufacturer. So down below here, you can see one manufacturer who has three different booms related here. Here's JLG has their most latest self-leveling boom lift. You end up seeing a tower boom lift, and you see a stick boom lift with track tires on it. So the operation of these and the operating characteristics of these on a job site are really significantly different. And that comes into the risk assessment, selecting the proper piece of equipment. You can see how this all becomes a very systemic issue about training. And so here again is the value that familiarization, model-specific familiarization, has on top of generic operator training for a classification. So again, when we're looking at this issue of familiarization, it's model specific. So you need training plus familiarization. And here are the bullets of the specific elements required within our standards to be part of familiarization. And the biggest part of that is operator manual. So too many times the thought of really what's happening in the marketplace is no one takes it out, nobody reads it. However, I will tell you that every requirement for an inspection mandates that you use that specific operator's manual. Because if you're doing a daily pre-start inspection, it is those items specified by the manufacturer. And in our prior slide, you saw these different models with different controls and different operating characteristics. So if you have a generic checklist, you're going to get a list that's checked and not an inspection that is following the requirements of this operator's manual. So here you can really see the significant need to really have familiarization and the adherence to being familiar with the operator's manual in the safe operation of that equipment. So we synthesize all of this. We say we have OSHA regulations, we have ANSI standards that have these requirements. You can get into the debate on required versus voluntary. But what happened when the industry as a whole got together, and this is ARA, which is the American Rental Association, represents rental companies, AEM, which is for equipment manufacturers, AED, which is for distributors, IPAF, which is general combination of all industry stakeholders for powered access equipment, and the Scaffold and Access Industry Association, who is the secretary of ANSI standards. We got all of the interested parties together, and we developed multiple years ago. Needs to be updated at this point. But at that point, we had the statement for best practices for general training and familiarization. And I bring this up because one of the things that you could look at here is the industry as a whole saying that if you're looking at general operator training, it should take anywhere from 3 to 6 hours or more, depending upon the class size and the number of equipment classifications to be covered. So if you have 2 people in the class and you're training them on a scissor lift, it's going to take a different amount of time than if you have 6 people in the classroom with 4 categories of aerial lifts that you want to get trained upon. But when it comes down to unit-specific familiarization, you end up having this information taken anywhere for 50 to 60 minutes. So depending upon the complexity of the specific model that you're dealing with, you may have a very simple push-around scissor lift, and the familiarization that can take a very short period of time. But when you're taking and I'll give you the example of the newest JLG self-leveling boom lift, to understand that, and it has 3 modes of travel on it, to be familiarized with that, even though you're a trained operator on boom lifts, 3Bs, it's going to take you a little bit more time to get familiarized with that. So this gives you a context or kind of a rule of thumb that says, hey, if I'm going to go out and I'm going to have someone give me training, and they're going to tell me they're going to train me in an hour, and they're saying that it's OSHA and ANSI compliant, you should be questioning that, because here is kind of what the industry is saying. This is kind of a rule of thumb for you to be using in your assessment of what appropriate training is. So we get to OSHA, and those of us who are in the industry have identified OSHA as the minimum legal requirements by law. So it's the minimum. So at a minimum, you have to do this. So when someone's going and saying, I'm OSHA compliant, I'm saying what you are is you're complying with the minimum requirements required by law. So think about it from this perspective about manufacturers. And manufacturers, from my perspective, ultimately set the requirements and criteria for the design, safe use, and training. And they are established requirements are the greater than or equal to OSHA standards, and generally are going to go greater than that. And I'm going to tell you that they are all reliant upon the ANSI standards. There's not a manufacturer that I know of in the world who is not designing and manufacturing them to be compliant with an industry standard. Now, do those industry standards take into consideration the law of the land? Yes. Again, minimum legal requirements, because we get into much more depth of specifics on the requirements implied. And within that, to the level that the manufacturers are implying these, and they sit on all of these standards, they're also applying those requirements for the safe use and training of this equipment. And that is where this reliance upon the industry standards, both the ANSI SAI standards in the USA and CSA standards in Canada. So what is compliant training? So again, I go back to compliant training is the process for ensuring employees understand all the relevant laws, regulations, even internal policies to your company that govern the task to be performed safely and effectively, following industry standards that are the best practices. It ensures that they know how, but even more importantly, why they need to adhere to these laws. If you go back to those pictures I gave you in the beginning of people who are doing tasks in an unsafe manner, really what they were looking at is, I need to get the job done, and that's the why that they were doing those things. And really what we need to do is say that while these are highly safe machines, the risk, the severity of hazards with them, say that this is why you need it, so you can go home at the end of the day to your family. So why should employers provide ANSI compliant training? This kind of sums up for me. Do the thing right and do the right thing. And in the opinion of myself and many industry experts who are involved with the development of these standards, from manufacturers to rental companies to training companies to users of this equipment, industry standards are really the foundation of best practices. So when we're going through all of the requirements that are out there, it's making sure that you are doing the right thing. So now I'm going to put a comma on this and take it to the next level, which is, all right, we talked a little about operator training and, you know, what training are you giving everybody? So staying with operators, once trained, always trained. So I've been in this for 4 decades plus at this point in my career, and I was trained in the 1970s. So because I was trained in the 1970s, am I a trained operator today? And so based on the prior standards, they said based on the user's observations and evaluations of the operator, retraining would be required. So if you're an employer, you're the user, and do you have qualified people out there observing and evaluating your operators on an ongoing basis to do that? When is that retraining going to be done? And now I'm going to go back to what's happening now. So retraining is defined as the required instructions based on the user's observations and evaluations to maintain a previously trained person's status as a qualified operator. So if you think about it in this context, and now within the standards, we have very detailed points of examples where retraining would be necessary. And this is not to exclude other potential places, but the expiration of an operator's valid training period. So today, if you go out there and you get training from different sources, I would say with aerial work platforms, the training period would be anywhere from 3 to 5 years. So at the expiration of that valid training period, they need to be retrained. They have a deterioration of performance. So in your observation or evaluations, deterioration of performance needs to be retrained. Operators extended period of time with no operation. Because I was trained in 1975, and here it is some years later, and if I haven't used the piece of equipment in that period of time, am I still qualified to go out there and do that? Or should some level of retraining be necessary? If you have someone who's been trained with a card that says it's good for 3 or 5 years, they haven't operated that piece of equipment in a year or 2 years, are they still trained and qualified, or should retraining take place? An operator's introduction to new or significantly different technology. That's a point for a level of retraining. The operator's been involved in an accident or near miss, or even within your group, one person has been exposed to an accident or near miss. Do you want to reinforce that with all of your operators to reinforce, wow, this happened, let's make sure that this doesn't happen again? So these are elements that retraining should take place. And again, I'm going to go back to the definition. It doesn't say train again. It says retraining, required instructions to maintain the previously trained person's evaluation. So sometimes retraining, as an example, we have a near miss. What retraining could be is a toolbox talk on a specific topic. Someone was near missed by an electrical overhead line. All right, let's get everybody together. Let's do retraining on that topic. Retraining could mean they need to be trained again as an operator. So they've been away from it long enough, and new standards have come in place, lots of new equipment. They really should get the full scope of training in place. So again, once trained, always trained, not the case. So be aware that these are elements that you need to employ as well. Who needs training? So again, from an OSHA perspective and some specifics within the industry standards, all workers must be qualified to perform the tasks. So when we think about the scope of operations for aerial work platforms, we have the managing and planning, we have operating and use, we have technical and engineering and specialized training. So within the standards today, we now have a requirement for managing and planning the process, which is here's users. You need to do risk assessments. You need to do ongoing evaluations and of the operators. So who's going to do that type of stuff? Who's going to make sure that they are getting the familiarization of the job site? So from that perspective, there are courses out there specifically required in the ANSI standards today is a MEWP supervisor requirement. So someone who is directly supervising the operators needs to have a level of knowledge so that they can evaluate them and properly. So they have to have a certain level of knowledge themselves on the subject matter in order to give a proper evaluation for them. Operators and use, we look at operators training, we look at operator renewals, we're looking at advanced training courses that are out there. You're looking at them using fall protection. So you may need to have a fall protection course that details the safe operation of that. Today we have additional elements that are out there, such as exiting at height under very defined risk assessment and procedures set in place that will take into place additional requirements for fall protection. So there's lots of additional information that's out there. Then we talk about technical and engineering, meaning the servicing of the equipment. You need to have people who are properly trained on how to maintain the equipment, how to do these inspections on the equipment, and specialized training, which is, if you're going to do operator training, you need to have an instructor. There are other elements out there, such as insulated aerial devices, which are on top of this general training that we're providing. You have training on items such as loading and unloading. So if you have a fleet that you're moving out there, what's the proper procedures for loading and unloading equipment, and certified persons for doing the inspections on the equipment. So there's a wide range of training that you should be looking at. So it's not just, let's get the operator trained and our job is done. There's lots of elements in taking a systemic approach to safe use of these products that needs to be applied. So I'm going to say that kind of concludes my overall presentation. I hope that it prompts you to think about this topic a little bit differently. And I hope that you are able to leave here with some additional knowledge that will make you safer and more productive in the use of these products. So at this point, I'm going to try to answer some questions. And I'm going to look up on here. Are there other training standards, or can this be applied to mast climber work platforms, bridge inspection units, which are types of elevating work platforms under the A92 standards? So the answer is that this standard applies to mobile elevated work platforms. So it really does apply to under bridge inspection devices, which is a 2B machine, and directly applies to that equipment. When it comes to mast climbing equipment or even telescopic platforms, there are specific standards for that. The A92 standards actually have a safe use and training standard that applies specifically to these products, I would say they are, we try to make them as similar as possible in terms of the scope of what's in there, but obviously, you can't go to a mobile elevated work platform course and say that I can operate a mass climber and vice versa. So there are differences over there, but there are those standards that apply to it. This standard that I'm talking about here really can cover the full range of all mobile elevated work platforms that are in place. So hopefully that addresses that question appropriately, Guy, and if not, you can pop in another question. This question can be answered anytime. When it comes to recertifications, when the student has not been trained by my company or myself, what are the rules surrounding this? I worry I cannot vouch for the quality of training the student received previously, and unless it is in the name brand, I know Genie, JLG, et cetera, I'm reluctant to issue a new card. Well, I think, Josh, that you're on target over here. When you're looking at retraining, that's why it applies specifically in the standard to the user's observation. So he's the one who got him trained, and he's the one who's observing him moving forward. If you provided the training to them, then you have the ability to, I'm going to say, retrain them based on what you delivered. But I would suggest to you, unless you have a standardized approach that says, all right, here's a means to recertify someone. So now I'll give you an example. There are VR simulators that are in the marketplace that have specific courses over there and can be utilized to do an evaluation of proficiency. So it gives you a straight line for that individual. So to the level that you have a means of doing that as an instructor to go through and do this. So an example would be, if I were to do a retraining, and in the example that you have, I would say, I have a theoretical knowledge test. I would give them that test. If they can pass that, they're giving you a document that can demonstrate they have some theoretical knowledge, and then I would put them through a practical to be able to evaluate them going forward. So that's how I would move forward with doing that. But I would have been using very strictly the requirements within the training standard to apply to that evaluation. I have heard both. Is the ANSI manual responsibility required on all machines or not? The answer is that it is not required in our new standards anymore. And in fact, any reference to the manual of responsibilities has been removed from the standards. It is still available, but it is not a specific requirement. The reason that it was removed is that it is a copyright document. And because it's a copyright document by ANSI, compliance with commercial terms, you can't have a requirement in there that says, in order to be compliant, you need to go to the single source. And that, unfortunately, is what the determination was. However, I would say that it's a great document. How many people out in the marketplace are aware of the standards? So in my opinion, having the manual responsibilities on the machines is now a voluntary decision, but I think that it makes a lot of sense. If the manual responsibilities that's still available is supplied by the manufacturer, by definition in the standards, it must be maintained on there. So if it is a manufacturer supplied document on the machine, then the answer is it must be maintained moving forward as a manufacturer document. So again, from a general requirement, the answer it is no longer required unless it is specifically supplied by the manufacturer at the time of delivery, and then it becomes a manufacturer document that must be maintained by the owner of the equipment. So I hope that answered that as well. So there are no other questions. We're actually expired our time. There was another question that came from the field that I'll kind of bring up. So if you're past your time and you need to leave, go ahead, but I will kind of put forward this question, which is Rick Heath, who had a conflict and wasn't able to be here. He wanted to ask the question, what consistent advice should be delivered to students with regard to operators' decisions to travel the MEWP in forward or reverse? And while I'm reading, interpreting Rick's comment, this comes to the point where when you're going in forward or reverse, it's really defining that you have an increased hazard when a lot of machines you rotate 180 degrees. Forward is now the opposite direction. So if I'm facing my control panel and I rotate 180 degrees and I push the controller to go forward, I'm now moving in reverse. So that becomes a training issue. That becomes an awareness issue because it's not that way on every machine. So this is where familiarization comes into it. An example would be on a skyjack boom lift. When it rotates past, and I'm going to say it's 95 degrees, the controller now recognizes that the front of the machine is the opposite direction. So when you push the controller forward, it's always going to move forward. On most other machines, whenever you rotate past that direction and you push it forward, it's always going in the direction of your steer wheels. So when you push forward and your boom is facing the opposite direction, it's still going that same direction, even though you're facing the opposite direction. Specific to the requirements within the standard, there is in the safe use standard very specific information regarding MEWP traveling. So all the things you should be doing before moving the MEWP forward or moving it or traveling with it. So there are very specific requirements in relationship to safe use in the standard. And I didn't want to get to the point where I put a little book in front of you, which goes through these, but those are the elements that must be addressed that are in there. And if I'm doing training and I'm talking about it, I think the thing that Rick was trying to bring up is this danger, which is when a boom rotates, you have the potential hazard of thinking that when I'm pushing the unit forward, it's now not going forward in the direction of view anymore. So that obviously is an area that needs to be addressed. And then another question that came from another individual is, what would I ask to ensure that the training is compliant? There is no means to ensure that all elements of training will be complied with unless you take and verify the deliverables against the industry standard. So if you said, hey, I need a copy of the course, I need to have this curriculum, I need to evaluate it, I need to have someone attend it, and then you do that evaluation, then you can make a determination. But if you go over it and everyone is saying that they're OSHA and ANSI compliant, the issue is you're going to have to do an evaluation. So the best suggestion we have is, that it takes time and best practices to do the training. So I've kind of given you, what all the industry associations combined came in that rule of thumb. It takes 3 to 6 hours. So if you have someone telling you that they can train you in an hour or 15 minutes, be aware that by the guidance of industry experts, that's not the case. And you can always ask your manufacturers for suggestions or go to companies that are industry leaders to provide you with training that will be of high quality and value. So let me see. If there's another question that came up. No question. Okay, so thanks, Scott, for the compliment. And again, I put this out and just say to all of you, there is a responsibility for all owners of the equipment. And let me go back to my slide here. The answer to this is do the thing right and do the right thing. So again, thank you all for your time. Again, we thank our sponsor for providing us the opportunity to have this session today. And this session is recorded and will be available online for others to look at. So that concludes our session. Thank you all and be well.